Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about bands versus chains on dynamic effort work, because it's something that does come up, and people will ask me about that. What's the difference? Is one better than the other? Hey, what do we do if we don't have bands and chains? And here's one of the things I will tell people. Yeah, straight weight is a good way to learn your speed work, but you eventually will benefit from accommodating resistance. And I'm not saying that everyone has to use the amounts I use and prescribe for a lot of my clients because your gym setups may not allow for it. But anyone can get a handful of mini bands. Anyone can set up dumbbells or find a way to hook up a rack to where you can attach, some mini bands eventually for your speed work. All right, so there's no actual reason, other than often the deadlifts can be the exception because they're the hardest to set up without appropriate equipment. But your benching, your squatting, there's no real reason to not use at least some band tension eventually. Again, it's not expensive, it's not equipment intensive to do that. I would honestly say that chains are the most equipment intensive. Right, chains are the most equipment intensive. And the funny part is, if you had to pick one or the other, I'm going to go with bands. Bands are probably slightly better for your speed work. And the reason that it has to do with that is that when we're looking at speed work, what we're trying to do is to lighten the weight slightly at the bottom. And we run very, very light weights. I mean, you guys can see in these videos, I don't have a lot of weight on the bar on any of this stuff relative to my maxes. At the time this video was made, you guys saw me benching 350 plus. Then you see what I use for speed work. You've seen me squatting over 500 pounds with these same bars, right? Over 500 pounds. You see one plate on each side, right? These are very, very light weights. However, I tend to run a lot of chain and a lot of band, a whole lot. Usually for benching, for example, minimum 100 pounds of band or chain. We start getting into squatting, usually at least 150 pounds. Minimum is how much band or chain I run. Yet it's still light overall. But what we're doing, we're trying to change our strength curve, right? We're trying to accelerate the weight as long as possible. We're trying to generate the fastest bar speeds that we can, and being a little lighter at the bottom helps. But we're trying to continue our rate of acceleration all the way through, right? We're trying to make it explode and maintain that speed curve. The problem with straight weight is what? We decelerate more quickly. When we have bands or chains, we can maintain the rate of acceleration longer because the weight gets heavier as we go up. The weight gets heavier as we go up. And if that's our only goal, then chains actually do the job. Okay, chains actually do that very effectively. And really, they're more predictable in doing it because there's no weird differences in the energy curve with storing energy or anything that changes with the eccentric reps. With chains, it's predictable. It's straight mechanical tension, right? Chains are always the same all the way through. There's no bizarre strength curve. In other words, if you set chains up correctly and they're done right, it's a linear increase. So if you run a setup that has 100 pounds of bar weight with almost no chain at the bottom, like maybe 5 pounds, and then 200 pounds of chains at the lockout, your strength curve is linear all the way through because the chains just mechanically unload, and barring a little bit of shifting of the size of the pile underneath when you run a lot of chains, it's just it's straight changes in mechanical tension, just like plates. Every one of those little chains is like adding little tiny micro plates, and as they unload, they're adding to the bar. So in the middle, it's 50%. 20% up, you've added 20% of the weight, and so on and so forth, that you're going to get through the entire strength curve. Now, what that does is that it changes our rate of deceleration as we go up. Okay, it allows for a higher mechanical tension on the muscles all the way through instead of just at the bottom, because a lot of these movements, that's where peak mechanical tension is, at least on some of the muscles. Squatting is a little more complicated. Benching, it's pretty straightforward though. We have the greatest mechanical tension on the triceps and pecs at the bottom. Squatting, we absolutely do, at least with the quads, right? The glutes and the adductors can change a little. Definitely the quads. So what we see is a linear increase. And for speed work, that works great. I mean, the chains themselves have their own pronounced training effect from this. With bands, it's different. Okay, with bands, it's different. The speed at which you accelerate the bands can change the way a little bit that they store energy on the way up. Okay, you have to outrun the bands. When we start running a lot of band tension, if we don't outrun the bands, it does weird things. They force us to stabilize very differently when we unrack. When you go to unrack a squat with 100, 150 pounds of band tension, or unrack a bench with 100 pounds of band tension, it's not like change. It doesn't feel like the weight that's on the bar. It tries to jerk you down. It's unstable. You have to get really tight to even lower it. And then what it does, it tends to jerk you down. So it creates a faster eccentric rep, even on the first rep, that you have to really stabilize. Okay, but what else does it do? It creates an overspeed eccentric, because with all these movements, if you guys watch, we're doing doubles and triples. They're not just one rep. So what happens at the top? Each time when we reverse, it creates an overspeed eccentric. The heavy bands jerk the weight down. Okay, if we get an overspeed eccentric, then what happens? Well, we get more micro tearing of the muscles. There could arguably, people always talk about eccentric overload. You know, you'll hear bodybuilders say, "Oh, we want an eccentric overload," and they think that doing a slow eccentric creates an eccentric overload. That's not what the studies really show. Studies show real slow eccentrics don't cause more hypertrophy. It's that overloading of the eccentric. Some of that could arguably be replicated when we run really heavy bands. Why? Because it jerks down the eccentric. Okay? It jerks it down, and we have to fight against it, and it tends to drop faster for part of the movement. All right, your peripheral nervous system has to respond differently. Okay, so not only do we get some of that potential micro tearing, particularly possibly beneficial for tendons, but what about when we reverse it? All right, that overspeed eccentric can create a larger stretch reflex, a larger myotatic reflex coming back out of the bottom. And if we get that, what happens? All right, we get a faster rate of muscle fiber recruitment getting up to those upper threshold fibers. In other words, the band tension creates an even larger training response from the speed work, from the dynamic work. Now, there are differences on bands and chains with max work and heavy work also. They create different effects, but we're talking just about the speed here. Well, that larger stretch reflex is going to give us, again, a more pronounced response. So in theory, it should be a superior contraction. Now, where's the downside? It seems to be a little easier to overtrain with bands. Normally with our speed work, it's very easy to recover from. We can do a lot more volume, and definitely with chains. We start getting into bands, it's that overspeed part, that micro tearing. Okay, if we try to do too much of it, it's easier to overtrain. It's harder on recovery. So we do have to watch that and be aware of that. That is the one downside to bands. We might get more benefit rep for rep. We also overtrain easier. So this is the difference between the two. And I'm generally more favorable towards bands, but I believe if you have access to both, there can be benefits to running both types. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.